This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen starts the show as he reviews a few of the agriculture-related decisions that were made in the 2026 Kansas legislative session. Logan Simon, K-State Extension agronomist, continues today's show as he discusses the factors of weeds, soil temperature, and seed quality for cotton planting. Ending the show is part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, and Todd Gunderson as they chat about common calving issues. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show hearing from K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Good to be with you again.
Roger, today wanting to talk about a few things that took place in the 2026 Kansas legislative session that have impacted agriculture, and the first one involving squatters. And why do we care about this in agriculture?
Actually, it's a big issue, Shelby. And what the legislature has done now is basically make it easier to get somebody off your property that is not supposed to be there. And we've got remote buildings and remote, maybe abandoned houses in agriculture. And people may move into those and become what the law calls a squatter on your property. And there used to be quite a detailed process to go through to get them out of there. And now what this allows this to be, other than a drawn-out civil eviction, you can now just submit a notarized affidavit to local law enforcement stating that the occupant is unauthorized. And on that affidavit, you're saying that the occupant entered in your property and remains there unlawfully. They're not a tenant. They're not my farm tenant. They're not a holdover tenant. And it's not anybody that's in my immediate family. It's because you can't boot those people out. And they've already been asked to leave, but they've been refused. And so once you do that and you meet those requirements, you file the affidavit and local officials can get them out of there in 24 hours.
When do many of these laws that we'll talk about today go into effect?
July 1. July 1 is going to be the key date. Unless there's a specific enactment date in the statute, everything defaults to July 1. And so most of these are going to, I think probably all of them are going to talk about, take effect July 1.
And another thing that was talked about, agritourism liability and thinking about people being on farms. What is this covering and what changes?
Yeah, this is an amendment to the Agritourism Promotion Act. So it's expanding the existing protections for specific type of agritourism operations in Kansas by here, not just the liability limitation and the protection provided that way, but by limiting the regulatory authority of local governments. And so the primary focus here is on non-public operations where the activity is strictly tied to ag production. And it exempts non-public agritourism operations from certain local building codes and zoning regulations that were originally designed for urban spaces, commercial urban spaces. So what they're saying here is we don't want the localities to have their local regulations expand to apply urban building codes to rural agritourism ventures. And so this should reduce the administrative and financial burden on farmers and ranchers who host guests, but yet don't operate as standard public commercial venues. And so these registered agritourism operations, and so there's a registration that's required, will, in essence, be exempt from local building codes, fire codes, safety codes that are not specifically designed for ag settings. So if you're using a barn for a wedding venue, or you've got a winery or a farm stay, for example, the local county cannot require the installation, for instance, of industrial grade sprinkler systems. They can't force you to be compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act by putting in elevators, those type of things, which would be required for a commercial hotel or a banquet hall, as long as your structure meets basic safety standards as used for agritourism. Then you're going to be exempt. So that's designed to help expand agritourism activities and, of course, off-farm income for farmers and ranchers.
And talking about things with legislation and agriculture, of course, we're going to talk about water. And what is one bill that was handled in the recent session?
One was what's known as the Stream Obstruction and Dam Regulation Bill. And so what they're doing here is they're updating the regulatory framework that governs dams and levees and stream obstructions and giving us a clear delineation between what is a dam and what is a stream obstruction. A dam would require additional permits and compliance rules. Stream obstruction, no, it does not. And so what they've done is they set in a bunch of requirements to specifically separate those out. And hopefully this will help people understand when you've got to deal with the state, when you don't have to deal with the state. It's put a safe harbor in there designed to let farmers maintain their own field crossings without having to call the state, provided they aren't flooding their neighbors. So we still can't change the natural drainage flow of water to the detriment of a neighbor. But this, when you're dealing with a water obstruction where you can address it on your own, and it's not a dam and it's not affecting your neighbor, you don't have to go through a permitting process. You don't have to contact the Department of Agriculture. You don't have to contact the state water office and get a permit in these situations. So that law is designed to clean that up a little bit.
And what changed for the law with the Kansas Water Appropriation Act?
Well, again, significant changes here. And this is basically a couple of things. One is a change of use notification. So it's just amending the law, the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, to increase public transparency and expand the notification requirements for new water appropriations, or if you're making a significant change to existing water rights. So they're shifting more responsibility to the Kansas Department of Agriculture also to maintain digital records and ensure that a broader group of neighboring landowners are informed of potential water use changes and get notice of these change of use applications. And the state has to provide written notification to all water right owners who have a point of diversion, and any application for a new diversion of water or any application to change a point of diversion by more than 300 feet, or if you're going to change the boundaries of a proposed water conservation area. So that portion of the bill is a notification requirement. So you're going to be notified of any changes or application for a change in a water right. And the Department of Agriculture has to maintain an online interactive map on its website showing the location of all applied for diversions and requested changes of more than 300 feet. So they've got a couple of months until, again, this one doesn't start until July 1. They've got a couple more months to get that website up and running. But this is going to be interesting to see how this one works. You're going to be able to go on that website and see who's making changes, who's making applications to change a point of diversion, who's making a new application. You're going to be able to see that on that website.
Taking a step back then from water, what changes did we see when it comes to livestock theft and maybe more of a change to a zero tolerance style?
Well, I'd say if you're in the business of cattle rustling, you better get your business transactions in Kansas done, get your cattle stolen before July 1, because the laws are going to change. Of course, I'm talking tongue-in-cheek there. But the law really gets much stricter in Kansas starting July 1. We're moving from a misdemeanor, potentially based on the value of the livestock stolen, to a felony right off the bat. They're not paying any attention to the value of the livestock. Theft of cattle and horses, as well as farm machinery, is going to go to a level 5 non-person felony. Again, not paying any attention to value. And the reason they've done this, I think, Shelby, is two reasons. One, the increased dollar value with respect to cattle, as the market's been very high. It's tempered a bit now, but it's still pretty good. And so there's a lot of value that's out there. And then two, when you look at Oklahoma, you look at Texas, the other major cattle states are surrounding Kansas or near Kansas. These are already felonies in those states. So they really go after cattle rustling hard in those states. And Kansas has been behind on this. It's just been a misdemeanor based on the value of the livestock. So they're trying to make our criminal law on this point consistent with what Oklahoma and Texas in particular have already done.
Is there also the inclusion of other farm assets in this?
Right. Farm machinery is also included in this. So theft of cattle, horses, farm machinery, those are all going to be a level 5 non-person felony. So again, this is dealing with a historical problem we've had here, because you could steal a single calf in Kansas and that might have been just treated as a misdemeanor, basically a slap on the hand if the market value was low enough. That's going to change starting July 1.
What are a few other key things that have taken place for the previous session of 2026?
Well, we've got seed registration fees. So there's an amendment to the Kansas seed law. The Plant Pest and Ag Conservation Fee Fund has been amended. And what they've done is increase the maximum allowable registration fees for seed wholesalers, increase the maximum annual registration fee for seed wholesalers, as well as the retailers on this. And each registration is required for each place of business. So if an individual operates as both a wholesaler and a retailer at the same location, they have to register and pay for both categories. And there's some other restrictions on what wholesalers are prohibited from doing. And it also gives the Kansas Department of Agriculture additional revenue potential because of these fees to administer seed and plant laws while giving us a grace period for businesses. So that's the development. Again, that one starts July 1.
Roger, with all these changes, and there are a few other in this blog article, which I will link in today's show notes, what does this all mean for farmers and ranchers in Kansas?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few others that we didn't talk about. This is a very active session in the Kansas legislature with respect to the impact on farmers and ranchers. But I think largely overall, if I were to sum it up, I'd say that the legal landscape has shifted now to favor landowner autonomy and transparency. They're trying to reduce regulatory creep in agritourism. They're providing digital tools for water tracking. They're hardening penalties for rural crime. They've really provided Kansas producers with a more predictable and secure operating environment. At least that's the purpose, and that's the hope as we go forward.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing factors for hopefully having the most successful cotton for planting in Kansas. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon. Logan, thanks for joining us today.
For having me on, Shelby.
Logan, before we talk about the cotton crop, first talking about the fields the cotton will be going in, and one phrase commonly heard, start clean, stay clean, and why is that something you see also is crucial for this crop?
Starting clean is the only way that we are going to stay clean in our cotton crop. Keeping in mind that cotton is a crop that we are growing on 30-inch rows pretty consistently in the state of Kansas, and we're very slow to canopy. In that way, there's a significant delay in the suppressive ability of that crop canopy against weeds. So we've got to keep that crop clean to keep those weeds out, as they are not only a yield robber in the case of a cotton crop, but also all of that weedy stuff out there in the field goes on to degrade our eventual lint quality, showing up as trash in our grades. And so starting clean is absolutely essential. Tillage, of course, comes to people's mind. It is take some iron through it. That's one way to start clean. But in reality, most cotton acres in the state of Kansas are going to be in some sort of conservation tillage system, either reduced or no-till. And so effective herbicides are absolutely essential. Glyphosate is still a key part of our burn down programs out there, and we often see folks pairing that with some other formulations like some flumioxazin or such as Valor or others. Paraquat and glufosinate are still very important out there as pre-plant burn downs. We've also seen with a newer product that we're using a lot of now, thiophenicil, which is Reviton, that has become a really popular formulation out there as well in our burn downs. Just in my own work, we've been seeing some really good success with that. It is very important for folks to recognize when they are going out with something like a dicamba or 2,4-D product or synthetic auxins. It's important that we understand what we are going to be planting in there. If we are looking at a dicamba-resistant cotton versus a 2,4-D resistant cotton. And the majority of our growers are likely to fall in that 2,4-D category. But if we are not, we need to be mindful that it is a 21 to 28-day waiting period following dicamba application planting a non-dicamba resistant cotton. It's 30 days from applying 2,4-D to planting a non-2,4-D resistant cotton. So be very mindful of the variety that you are growing, whether we've got that dicamba or 2,4-D resistance. And again, the majority of our growers are going to be in that 2,4-D category with our enlist cottons. But again, for those that may be using a dicamba tolerant technology, we need to be mindful of that non-compatibility between the dicambas and 2,4-Ds out there.
And going back to that phrase of start clean, stay clean, focusing on the stay clean portion, residual herbicide something that producers should also be keeping in mind?
Residuals are absolutely essential in cotton, and we have a lot of technologies available to us. So when we think about some of our residuals that are out there, we have a number of products that fall in that group 15 category. Those are going to be things like acetochlor, which is warrant, S-metallochlor, which is dual, dimethenamide P, outlook, or pyroxysulfone, which is Zidua. We do see a lot of Zidua used out there in the field. We also have our group 5s out there that are also used pretty commonly. Fluometron, which is Cotoran, or Prometrin, which is Caprol, are also pretty popular out there. However, we do need to be mindful with all of these as there are significant rotation restrictions out there with some of these products. So be mindful of what your rotation plans may look like, or for example, in the case as we did see in 2025, where we had some replants, or in this case, switching crops. It is important to know what kind of residual we put out there to know if we have lost that cotton crop when it's too late to replant, whether we are able to rotate to switch to grain sorghum or soybean. We do need to know what we've got out there.
Weed control, just one factor. What are a few other factors for producers to keep in mind?
2026 is going to be yet another adventure for Kansas cotton growers in terms of the best time to plant cotton for good establishment. We at Kansas State University strongly recommend paying attention to our soil temperatures. We often use 60 degrees Fahrenheit at the planting depth in Kansas as our baseline for acceptable soil temperatures. Other cotton growing areas may prefer something like 64 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, but we really encourage folks to pay attention to that 60 degrees Fahrenheit in that 4-inch soil zone. And we have seen a lot of areas in southern Kansas reaching that threshold. Just back on April 8th, we already had several of our Kansas Mesonet weather stations through southern Kansas showing temperatures, 7-day average soil temperatures in the 4-inch zone at or above 60 degrees Fahrenheit through the cotton growing regions of South Central as well as down into Southwest Kansas. And so in terms of soil temperatures, we are in good shape. The outlook also favors warmer temperatures, and so that's also pretty encouraging as we think about potential for cotton planting. However, soil temperatures are only part of the equation. And this is kind of similar to what we experienced in Kansas in 2025, where we reached acceptable soil temperatures fairly early, but especially in the Southwest region, we had some very cool nighttime temperatures that drug our ability to accumulate growing degree days for cotton. It really drug down our ability to do that. When we think about the role of air temperature in growing degree days as it relates to cotton stand establishment, we're really thinking about the first 5 days following planting. With cotton, our growing degree day calculation uses a base of 60, which is a higher base than something like corn. We don't really have much of an upper threshold in cotton, but as we are calculating those growing degree days for those first 5 days, our optimal planting date is going to coincide with a time period when we are going to accumulate an acceptable level of growing degree days in those next 5 days. So the values that we use in the cotton industry, which have been developed by others in the cotton belt, if we fall in the 15 or less for growing degree day units in the first 5 days, those are what we call marginal to very poor conditions. This usually happens when our nighttime temperatures are dropping just way too low. Ideally, those nighttime temperatures are going to be getting at least above 50, ideally closer to 60. Good to adequate is going to be in the 16 to 35 DD60 accumulation for those 5 days. And that may be acceptable depending on the quality of your seed. And then finally, really, we would love to see as many of our growers as possible planting in a window that is very good to excellent. And very good, that's going to be in that 36 to 49 DD60 range for those 5 days. And then excellent is 50 or above. We have parts of south central Kansas at those lower elevations where nighttime temperatures tend to be a little higher than in higher elevations in the southwest, where excellent is often very achievable. In the far southwest, our irrigated growers in the deep southwest, they may struggle to hit excellent just because of our lower nighttime temperatures and that impending June 1st cutoff where we start to lose insurance coverage. So we may see our growers in that area favoring something a little bit less than excellent simply due to that impending June 1st cutoff timeframe.
You mentioned seed quality, and so what factors for that should producers keep in mind?
Yeah, so with seed quality in cotton, we have two different scores that are going to come out. Every bag that you receive, every cotton seed bag will have a warm germination score printed on the label. And the warm germination score is useful. It is useful. However, especially for our growers here in Kansas, we also want to be using that cold germination score whenever possible. It may or may not be printed on the label. So I highly encourage producers, if you do not see a cold germination score printed on the label, reach out to your seed company and ask them for the cold germination score for that seed lot to give you the best idea of the quality of your seed. Excellent quality seed is absolutely essential for that earliest planting range that we have here in Kansas. We have to go out with the very best seed quality we possibly can. And then with something a little bit lower, as we get later on in our period with some warmer temperatures, we can go out with some slightly lower quality seed. We're very thankful in Kansas to our seed industry because they tend to send very high quality seed up to us, which we are much appreciative of. But again, really encouraging people, pay attention to those warm and cold germination scores. They're essential to success.
Logan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me on, Shelby.
That was K-State Extension agronomist Logan Simon. I will link to Agronomy e-update articles on this topic in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Wednesday show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, and Todd Gunderson.
Does cattle handling influence malpresentation that could lead to dystocia? So malpositioning of the calf where the head's back or a leg's back. Does it matter how we handle those calves? So, Bob, I'm going to turn to you first. This is a Therio type question.
Yeah, it is. And I really don't know the answer to this. So malpresentation, and the most common are like one leg back, sometimes two leg backs, or a head back, those types of things. And I would agree with this listener in that sometimes it seems like we have a cluster of them. It should just be random. It just every few cows, something like that. I don't know why the clusters occur. A lot of times we want to blame it on something, but it's not consistently associated with most of the things I can think, because some of the questions are, well, maybe it's feedstuffs, maybe it's handling, those types of things. And I'm not going to say that's not true, but it's not a strong enough pattern to really see an outcome. So I think Todd's got a few things that probably really do affect this, but I'm stuck with, sometimes there's more than we expect in a cluster, but it's real hard for me to figure out exactly why. But if you want to blame lack of low-stress handling, it's a great teachable moment.
So if we think about in heifers or cattle having their first calf, most dystocia is due to fetal dam size mismatch. Mm-hmm. And you may see 13%, 14%.
Yeah, and some of those show up as a head back or something like that, just because there's not quite enough room in the pelvis for everything all at once.
Most of our dystocia in cows is malpresentation.
Yes.
What would be your expected rate?
I'm going to say 5% or less. It's common enough that you've got cows, you'll run into it, but it's certainly most cows can have the calf without assistance.
So I looked up a couple of articles on this just because I was curious, and I'd seen this in practice. You'll have occasional clusters, like Bob said, where it seems like you end up with a lot of a certain type of malpresentation, and it makes you think, geez, there must be something going on here to have this many show up all at the same time. So one of these was a review article of malpresentations in dairy cattle that was published in the aughts, and the other was a study that was done on beef cattle in Colorado back in the 70s and 80s, published in the early 90s. And, a couple of things they found. You probably anywhere from 10 to 20%. 20% would be probably the high end of the distribution. 10% probably be on the low end of calves that require some assistance. And to Brad's point, most of those are going to be because of mismatch in fetal size and maternal pelvic size. But on the malpresentation side, there were a few risk factors that they find that were associated with a higher rate of malpresentation dystocia. And they were a little interesting. One is the number of calves in the uterus. And that's one that...
if you have twins.
Yeah, if you have twins...
They don't come out right.
They don't come out right. And that lines up with my biases. I pulled a lot of calves in practice. It seems like if I ever got called out for like a head back, for instance, I almost always would find a twin behind that calf when I had a head back. And that's something that these studies also seem to show, is that if you have more than one calf in there, the probability of a malpresentation is high. And then the other one that was kind of interesting that was in both of those studies was the sire of the calf was associated with the probability of that calf having a malpresentation. And that's sire within breed for the beef cattle study, and I think it was that way for the dairy study as well. And I don't have the reason for that, and these were observational studies, so we don't really know for sure why that is. If I had to hypothesize, I would say that much of what gets a calf into the pelvis is instinctual behavior on the calf's part, to put their legs up, to put their head up. It's an instinctual response on the calf's part. And that has to come from the genetics. That is coded into their genetics. And so if you have a sire that their coding isn't quite right or doesn't quite match up with the dam's genetics, you could see some more presentations problems.
And if it's associated with the sire, then that maybe is a reason sometimes we see some clusters in a ranch. And I think in some of those studies, size, weight was affected. And
Sure.
Bigger calves more likely to be in a malposition type of a thing. And maybe that's associated with the sire as well, both the size and even kind of the shape, the head and shoulders and those kinds of things. So there could be something just about the physical structure of that calf that makes it less likely to enter the pelvis correctly.
Once again, that was part of BCI's Cattle Chat podcast. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.